have a lot of stuff growing up, but what I did have is parents that loved me and a safe home that I could go to that I never felt any fear. Those two things alone will pretty much get most kids where they need to be at if you think about it. All these extra things are extra. Yeah, I admit I had a Nintendo when I was a kid and it was fantastic. But we'll just say that, you have these things and you're really nice, but you think about how hard our parents worked to provide those things for us. And if we can do the same for our children, what more can you ask for, right?
I'm Bethan Moorcraft.
And I'm Kadeem Layla.
And this is the Halfbank Podcast, brought to you by Money.ca.
Throughout this series, we've touched on some of life's major milestones.
Like going to college or trying to buy your first home.
However, we haven't touched on what might be one of the biggest changes in your life if you decide to pursue it, having kids.
According to RBC, the average cost of raising a child can add up to $10,000 to $15,000 a year for 18 years. For those who want to be parents, that price tag might force them to wait longer until they turn the office into a nursery.
For those who are on the fence about parenthood or are firmly not interested, the cost is just another reason to deter them.
According to a January Carter's poll, the desire to save more money is one of the top 5 reasons for women under 30 not wanting a child in the next 2 years.
The desire to focus on their careers was another.
So how do you decide if parenthood is right for you? What makes parenthood so expensive, and what costs do people not think about when they take the plunge?
In this episode, we'll be talking to a personal finance and budgeting expert who can break down the cost of children from his experience as an analyst and as a parent.
We'll also talk to a documentary filmmaker who's known since high school that she didn't want to be a mother.
We'll look at the ledgers of both sides in order to paint a picture of the different financial expectations and goals of would-be parents and child-free adults. We'll dive right in with money expert Barry Choi.
So now we have Barry Choi, money expert at moneywehave.com and also a parent to a 6-year-old daughter. Barry, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you on the show. So, Barry, we've already shared the RBC stat that raising a child can cost up to $15,000 a year, covering everything from food to clothing. I can see you laughing in the camera. So what are your thoughts in terms of, the average cost of raising children?
I think average is the right word because I know a lot of people who spend a lot more on their children. And there's quite a few people who can raise children for a lot less. I would say I'm about in average right now, but I have some certain expenses that I spend on my daughter, which I wouldn't say are normal. More of a luxury, if you want to put it that way, but we're in a fortunate position that we can give her that.
Yeah, that's great. What are some costs of raising children that might surprise people who haven't yet sort of gone down that road?
I would say the biggest thing for parents or people who don't have kids, rather, is the cost of daycare. It's expensive, but you don't realize how expensive it is until you're actually paying it, right? Like, okay, it's like, $1,500 to $2,000 in Toronto. It's like, oh, yeah, it's just there. But when you actually see it coming out of your bank account, it's a lot larger than it seems. And I know people listening will be like, hey, you know what? There's $10 a day daycare. You know what? That actually doesn't exist for everyone. When you actually start looking into the details, you realize it's much more complicated. Not every spot is available. And even on top of that, once daycare ends, you think you're going to get that $2,000 back. No, other expenses come up. One other thing I'll talk about really quickly, because we'll talk about it more later, is the fact that school these days, you got to pay for everything. I don't know when you guys were kids, if you remember, I didn't have to pay for anything. Field trips, everything, school supplies, it was all included. You didn't pay anything. But now, every single week, it's like, hey, donation day or a fundraiser day. Hey, you got to pay for the school bus to go on road trips. You got to pay for supplies. It's actually ridiculous how many things you got to pay for as a parent.
Oh. And I guess I was wondering along with, so you're paying more for schooling especially, and I guess you've probably heard about the changes to the Canada Child Benefit, kind of a new maximum. I guess I'm wondering what you think of that and kind of like some of the pros and cons of that program.
The Canada Child Benefit, I think it's great for what it is. It was redesigned, I feel like it was like 10 years ago or 6 years ago, whenever it was, to really help lower income families or families that don't have a high income. So to me, it makes a lot of sense for them to really focus on those kids who need the additional help. But at the same time, though, it's not like this money is going to go super far. Don't worry, don't get me wrong, it'll definitely help. But there's a lot of people these days, whether they're low income or not, that are struggling, with cost of inflation, mortgage prices going up. So, you could have a high income and still be struggling to raise your kids. So, yeah, these extra benefits are good, but it doesn't apply to everyone. And that's a bit complicated.
I wanted to just touch back on the cost of childcare. I've heard from multiple kind of young parents that is the one shocker where, and it's not something you can just say, oh, well, we won't bother with that. A lot of people have to go back to work. Parents might not live nearby or might not be able or willing to help. And so you do have to do it. Do you see a trend of that cost increasing because more people need to use the service?
It definitely can increase depending on where you live. I've got a lot of friends that live in downtown Toronto, and they say that, their childcare costs are easily 50% more. And then you think about rural communities where there might not be as many, nannies or daycare spots. If the nannies know there's a lack of supply and a huge demand, they're going to charge you huge amounts for it. So yeah, you got to budget for it. I'm speaking just from having a single child. When, you've got two kids and you're paying $4,000 to $6,000 a month in childcare, you're wondering if you should even bother going back to work, because unless you're making significantly more, you're probably better off staying at home and spending those years with your kids. And admittedly, that's a tough decision for a lot of people, because one parent is going to see their career suffer as a result, and they're giving up more than just their income.
Yes, definitely very interesting. I was one of three, and we were all very close in age. So we were rugrats running around when we had childcare. But yes, I think it was definitely a financial burden that, we've discussed as a family, and something that I'll think about moving forwards too.
Oh, for sure. And then we're also wondering too, because there has been, research on how more people basically kind of lean on their parents a bit more financially than say 20 years ago. People might be, especially staying at home longer due to the issue of house prices. So with the case of people who might still be kind of relying on their parents a bit for money, like, are they basically, is there a way to be kind of still financially able to be parents if you're in that situation where you still need help from your parents?
I think it's tricky because, raising a child is more than just about finances. The reality is quite often children only need a safe home, roof over their head, and food, right? So you don't need to be rich to have kids. But obviously, it's definitely difficult. You can't exactly plan a pregnancy all the time. Sometimes life happens, right? So yeah, if you're relying on your parents and then all of a sudden you have a child at the same time, it can be a very difficult situation. But that's where a lot of families start to make those tough decisions, having a multi-generation household, or figuring out if that means working multiple jobs, having a side hustle. When my parents moved to Canada, it was my brother and I at a young age. My mom worked multiple jobs, brought in some extra income because she just knew that it would help us in the long run.
And I guess I wonder as well, you had mentioned some luxuries that you're able to provide for your daughter. Are you comfortable discussing what any of those are?
Oh, we should definitely talk about it to show how ridiculous things can get about. So, let's talk about some luxuries first, or some basic ones that a lot of people can relate to. When my daughter was born, or rather before she was born, my wife had demanded that we get the fancy stroller. I don't even remember how much it cost, but to me at the time, it seemed like an insane amount of money. It's a popular brand. I'm not going to talk about it, but anyone who's got a baby wants the stroller. They have all these attachments. It's a bit nuts. Admittedly, it was a very nice stroller. You know what I mean? But at the same time, sometimes you wonder, is that what my daughter really needed? Or more importantly, I would say, would it have been better for us to buy it secondhand? Because obviously kids will grow out of the stroller eventually. You can save easily 50% if you bought these on the used market. It probably would have been a better investment, because unlike car seats, baby strollers, you can buy it secondhand and there's not really any safety concerns. But one luxury I will talk about that is totally unnecessary, but something that we enjoy to do. And again, just because we have a single child, it makes things a little bit easier. But we travel often. We travel once or twice a year. Before my daughter was 2, she had been on more airplanes than I had until I was like 16 or 17. These are just some of the luxuries I'm talking about that are totally unnecessary. So yeah, obviously if I cut back some of those expenses, then yeah, I could put more money in our pockets.
I expect that's only going to, could potentially get worse as your daughter grows older, because I'm thinking today and looking at a comparison between, parents maybe with teenagers today versus parents with teenagers 20 or 30 years ago. They want iPhones and, the latest amazing laptop, and whatever's trending on social media is kind of like cool to have. So how are you prepared mentally and financially for those types of things that will come?
I am not prepared whatsoever for those conversations, because I'll tell you this, again, being in a fortunate situation, when I want something, I just buy it. You know what I mean? That's a nice thing about being an adult who's, got to control their finances. When you see something shiny and new that you want, you just go out and buy it. You don't need to ask for permission, right? I have no doubt that my daughter will ask for these things, and I'll kind of figure it out when I get there. But I'm hoping I'll pass on some tips in the sense that maybe delayed gratification. If you really want that item, maybe you just got to save up for it and use your own money. But the joke is now that whenever she goes to my parents' place or grandparents' place, my mom likes to give her like $2 and my dad likes to give her $2. Now she's figured that out. She's like, oh, when we're the next time we're going to go to grandparents, because she just wants to get money, right? So as much as I like to think I'm smarter than her, I feel like she's going to outsmart me later, especially when there's more technology that I'll have no clue about.
She sounds like a savvy 6-year-old already.
That would be the case.
We're wondering, so we touched on social media just now. I guess I'm wondering, are there any other big difference you see in terms of raising a child now versus, say, 20 years ago?
Social media is the biggest thing, and we got to talk about that. Instagram, you always see friends, or social media in general, you see what they're posting, what they're doing. It's on demand right away, and you can't help but feel like, should I be doing that? Should I be doing that with my kids? Should I be taking them to that new restaurant, to that cafe, to that vacation? And admittedly, I'm guilty of this too. I was just talking about how my daughter's been to Disney World twice, and unfortunately, she tells her friends these things. And then like her friends are asking their parents, can we go to Disney World, right? And it is a huge problem. Like, fortunately, most of like her close friends, the parents know me, and I tell them like, listen, it's work most of the time. I'm not even paying for these things. So but it's a very complicated situation. But overall, it's actually fascinating how things have changed significantly in the last 20 years or even the last 10 years. And, this conversation we're having now, by the time my daughter's 10, it might not even be relevant. It's very interesting.
And I'm also wondering, so we're looking at, seeing the age of first-time mothers kind of increase. So 2012, 2016, we see a jump to a national average of just over 29, BC leading the way with 31. So are there different financial considerations that you can think of for someone who might be becoming a parent, possibly, in their 30s, like more common now, or say possibly, early 20s instead?
Oh, if we're strictly talking about an age thing, I think there's one thing that's definitely worth talking about that a lot of people don't think about. Obviously, the older you get, the harder it is to have children. My wife and I had decided that we were going to have children in our late 20s, early 30s, right? So kind of about that demographic. That was our idea, but honestly, it took much longer to get pregnant than we thought it would take. And we actually needed help with IVF. So with that, and the whole process was about a 6 or 7 year process. My wife had her child around 35, 36-ish, so it's much older. So the amount we spent was close to $20,000 in IVF treatments. So people who think that they'll just be able to get pregnant right away, they may not realize that there's a lot of additional costs that may come up. And that's only if you're successful. We got lucky in the sense we were successful pretty quickly, but we know many families who weren't successful and spent 3-4 more times than we did. So there are always additional costs to be aware of. It's not a linear path.
So when couples decide to have a child or that they want to go down that route, that's just the beginning, the decision, we're going to do it. And as you said, sometimes it can be unplanned, and therefore, you don't have, you skip that step. How important is it then to kind of sit down together and look at a budget, create a financial plan, a budget where you can kind of roll with that as you're going through this amazing life adventure?
That's a great question, especially when you consider what's been going on in Canada over the last year. When my wife and I decided to start trying, we kind of created a budget, like, those fake budgets. One great piece of advice my mom gave me back in the day, this was like, 15, 20, I don't remember how many years ago, was like, in an ideal world, if you can live on one income between you and your partner, you won't have any issues, because that way, obviously, if one person gets laid off, health issues, whatever, you can survive. And, you think about it, it's the same thing applies to parental leave, a maternity leave. If you can get away with just one income, then you're great. So that's what we did. We budgeted everything out. We saw what we said, and then we actually kind of did a dry run before our child was born. Like, let's see if we can do 3 months on this one budget to see if we can survive without any real issues. And we didn't have any problems with that. But, this was 6 years ago. You think, I don't know the exact numbers, but I'm pretty sure housing prices have gone up probably about 50% since then, which is absolutely bonkers. Inflation is higher. Salaries have not increased as much. So trying to do that now would be very complicated. So a lot of families or a lot of parents would be, need to make tough decisions early and maybe rethink what their life is going to look like. I'm of a certain vintage where a lot of my peers expect that you're going to have that kid, you're going to move out to the suburbs, you're going to have all that support. We talked about the parents helping, but sometimes your parents have health issues and they can't help. Then you got to get additional support. Now, commuting from the suburbs, that's an additional cost. So there's no set path anymore. So what you may think will work out perfectly won't always be the case.
That's an interesting idea of kind of figuring out if you can live on one income. Would you mind kind of breaking it down a bit more in terms of some short-term goals that couples should work towards, and then perhaps some longer-term planning for as their children grow up, want to go to university, etc.?
I would say right at the beginning that what you want to do more than anything else is just stay afloat, right? You know what I mean? You just want to be able to pay your bills, not worry too much about if an emergency happens, what am I going to have to sacrifice? Am I going to have to sacrifice electricity, the type of foods we eat, just because we got to pay something else? That's why having an emergency fund is so important. But of course, thinking about the long term, setting up things for your child's education, such as a registered education savings plan, is ideal since the government will give you a match. But at the same time, we're talking about how the cost of housing has gone up so much. I know a lot of families that have a dual income situation, make it a decent amount of salary, but in the end, it's still hard to, max out the RESPs, the TFSA, the RRSP, because there's just so much money going out and not enough money coming in. You kind of need to prioritize. And sometimes I tell people that as much as your intentions are really good to help your kids in the future, you really need to think about yourself first, because what good are you going to do if you're going to rely on your kids 20 or 30 years from now for income because you sacrificed everything for them? So it's always a very tricky situation. And I think most experts are telling you need to focus on yourself first. So if you've got debt or you've got not enough savings, you got to focus on yourself and not think about RESPs or other things.
Do you view it as a bit of maybe a misconception that when you have kids, especially young ones, that you sort of have to give up traveling? Like, with, say, average income and so forth, can it still be doable to be able to enjoy some of the things you did, prior to having a kid?
I think you can definitely still travel. You just got to be smarter. And travel is something that's completely different that has also changed significantly since the pandemic. Airlines have never been fuller and airfare prices have never been higher. But at the same time, younger Canadians, a lot of Canadians in general are saying they're spending a lot less on travel. And if you kind of read in between the lines there, it basically implies that people with money are still traveling, but people who are kind of a little bit more tight on the budget are cutting back. So you can still travel. You just got to be smart about where you travel. When I was a kid, I never traveled every single year. It's a luxury I enjoy right now because I'm able to, again, because of work. And my daughter doesn't realize that. But, if you've got to save up for a few extra years so you can travel once every 5 years, that's not a bad thing. Maybe you're taking more day trips or driving road trips instead of flying. Maybe that makes more sense. Or taking advantage of where you have families and friends who are willing to host you can also be very beneficial.
One thing I wanted to return to, earlier you were talking about luxuries and you mentioned the stroller. Your wife wanted the best one. You said that perhaps you should have bought it secondhand because you don't need them for that long and, it can move into someone else's hands. Can you share any other kind of money-saving hacks that you've learned through your parenting experience or any other ways that young couples can kind of cut back on costs?
Buying secondhand, just about everything for kids, unless it's something safety related, is one of the best ways to go. Because honestly, kids grow up so fast and they get so many gifts that parents literally cannot go through them quick enough. A lot of people will be looking to sell these things. Anything you can think about for a baby can be bought online. Facebook Marketplace, Kijiji, there are so many great ways where you can save. I would argue it's kind of crazy in the sense that I can't believe how much research we have to put in as adults or as parents to figure out where you can save money, what options are available, because there are tons and tons of options out there.
Oh, thank you. Because I think I personally relate. My mom has definitely told me that she used to get me very expensive shoes and clothes when I was like 6, 7. I think by the time I hit 10, she's just seeing how fast I shed through them. And then she's like, I look back, she's like, if I do that again, I'm not doing that. And with my little sister now, who's, 16 years younger, she's definitely taking a different approach.
Yeah.
Still buying some nice things, not all secondhand or anything, but still buying some nice things, but definitely not splurging on the things that she knows she'll probably outgrow in, say a few months.
It is bonkers how fast the kids grow. Last year or the year before, but she literally went through like 3 pairs of shoes and boots and 3 jackets. Here's one fun tip, which we actually learned from that specific experience. because we had to buy her jacket mid-season, everything was on sale. So everyone was trying to clear everything out, right? So we're like, oh, well, we're going to have to buy a new jacket next year. Why don't we just buy the jacket now? It's 50% off and she'll grow into it. So now we've learned, like, oh, actually buy the next year, a year before when it's all on sale. So, winter clothes starts going on sale in like January, right? It's actually nuts. You just got to plan a little bit more. I'll say this as a parent, it's actually surprising what you can spend money on for your kids. Like, anything is available these days. Like, it's absolutely nuts. So one good example that everyone can relate to is indoor playgrounds. As a kid, there is no such thing as indoor playground now. It's like everyone's obsessed with it. I think it's cool. I drop my daughter off. She goes nuts for 2 hours. I can sit down and just play on my phone. You know what I mean? There's bike camp. Literally, as a child, like I'm sure the two of you also, you learn to ride a bike on your own. You fall many, many times. You eventually figure it out. Now you can literally pay someone to teach your kid how to ride a bike. And it sounds ridiculous, but the first day I dropped her off, I came to pick her up, and at the end of the day, she already knew how to ride a two-wheeler. And I was like, this is fantastic. I don't have to deal with the drama, right? If you have the money, your life can be a lot easier. Or even like learning to swim. It's a basic skill that a lot of parents obviously want their kids to learn for obvious reasons, but it can be tough, especially the city-run programs, because they need to cater to everyone. So it's accessible and it's inexpensive, but you can't push them too hard. But if you're willing to pay for private lessons and just private groups, private organizations, you pay more, but your kids will learn a lot, how to swim a lot faster. Anyways, what I'm getting at is if you've got money to spend, your kids can learn just about anything these days. And unfortunately, not every parent will have that money to spend.
On that topic as well, so being financially ready for a parent, do you think that there's a way to sort of know when you're ready for that, or are you truly ever like completely financially ready?
I wouldn't say you're ever financially ready. Yes, obviously you want to be in a space where you can provide your kids the life you want to give them. But it goes back to what we were saying earlier. Kenny, what you talked about, how you're raised with your mother, and how even myself as a child of immigrant, I didn't have a lot of stuff growing up, but what I did have is parents that loved me and a safe home that I could go to that I never felt any fear. And those two things alone will pretty much get most kids where they need to be at. If you think about it, all these extra things are extra. Yeah, I admit I had a Nintendo when I was a kid and it was fantastic.
Oh, me too. N64 first console. Remember that?
Yeah, I'm showing my age here. Okay, brother. But we'll just say that, you have these things and they're really nice, but you think about how hard our parents worked to provide those things for us. And if we can do the same for our children, what more can you ask for, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Just building on that, do you have, part of being financially ready, maybe, to have a child is sort of being able to coach them as they grow older too. And as you said, you've been able to take your daughter traveling and you're able to send her to camp, etc. But do you feel the pressure of bringing her up as a financially responsible person as well? And do you have any tips on parents trying to navigate that with their children?
I do think there's a huge burden actually for parents to raise their kids on so many different levels. And at the same time, things are changing so often, you never know what's going to happen. I try to explain to my parents, so my daughter's grandparents, what's relevant these days, how things work. And my dad just can't even understand the concept. So part of it is not just making sure your kids are financially savvy, but understanding changing technology, changing careers, right? And how things work. When I was in high school, no one was pushing any kids or high school kids towards the trades. And now the trades are in the most demand careers out there, right? Like I said, it's actually nuts. Or even when I was, finishing high school, coding and computer programming wasn't a big thing. Now everyone's exposed at a relatively young age. But in general, yeah, if you want to teach your kids some basic financial steps to get them on the right path, because they're not going to be taught that stuff in school. We talk about financial literacy. I'm a money expert. What you guys do is basically financial literacy at the same time. You think about your peers. How many people don't know how to file their taxes? How many people don't understand the basics of tax brackets? They think if they work overtime, they're going to get taxed more, so it's not worth their trouble, but that's just not the way it works. So yeah, there's a huge burden on parents to make sure their kids are financially savvy, or at least have some basic understanding, because that's what my parents taught me. They're like, they said straight up, they can't teach me everything, but they can show me the basics, and then it's up to me to learn more.
All right, well, thank you so much. I think we found some interesting tips here, how to get a PS, another game system free. I think this will be very valuable for our listeners. So thanks a lot for your time, Barry.
No problem. Anytime.
right. So after discussing the costs, perils of parenthood, what sticks out in your mind first, Bethan?
I thought it was interesting what Barry was saying about, he enjoys spending his money on his child. As he said, he's lucky to have the discretionary income to be able to kind of splurge on some luxuries for his daughter. And she's a very lucky young lady.
Yeah,
But
sounds like it. Yeah.
but some families, a lot of families, especially if you're having a child really young and you haven't had time to kind of save up a bit of a money pot there, might not have that discretionary income to spend on luxuries. And I think that that's okay. We were talking before this podcast about how we grew up and what we spent money on, etc. And in my free time, I would just be outside kicking a ball around with my neighbors all day, every day.
Right.
It's free.
I wanted to expand on that too, because I just have noticed that there is a bit of a connection between having the discretionary income sometimes and then being able to actually spend time with your children. So if you're working possibly, one job instead of two, that frees up more time for you to actually be able to spend time with your kids, which can lead to kind of, better experiences with them, can lead to, say, maybe a more enriching, experience with your kids as you grow up. Because I was listening to another podcast where they mentioned, children of immigrants, as Barry had mentioned as well, and that their parents were just working so hard when they were younger, trying to provide that they didn't actually spend much time with them at that stage. And then now that they're in a position where they have more discretionary income, they're able to actually carve that time out. It gives them the freedom to do that.
Mm-hmm. It also reminds me of something that Barry said about the cost of childcare. Some parents having to make a choice about whether they go back to work or they say, I'm just going to stay at home and take care of the kids whilst they're young before they go to school because we can't afford that 2,000, 4,000, 6,000, however many kids you have,
right.
Fee monthly, which is a staggering amount of money when you compare it to the rent you're paying as a mid-25-year-old in Toronto, for example.
No, you weren't exaggerating when you said it is just another rent. So, I mean, thinking about that, like having to basically possibly sacrifice just a career in that sense for a few years at a time, at least, is staggering. And I know Barry mentioned what he did with his family in this case was actually working off a single income. And, he did that pre-COVID, he made sure to mention, because since then we've seen prices for just everyday things rise. That's groceries, gas, mortgages. So it's, tough to see if he could possibly pull that off now. I'm wondering how many people, especially if they live in an expensive hub like, Greater Toronto area of Vancouver, if they would be able to pull off just having a single income.
Mm-hmm. That also leads nicely into our next discussion with Therese Shechter, because we're going to be talking about young couples, young people choosing not to have children or waiting longer until they decide to have children. And one of the reasons for that choice is career.
Right.
And the idea of giving up your career to be able to afford childcare, or because you can't afford childcare, so you've got to stay at home, to some people who are at the start of a very exciting working life, they're trying new skills, they're earning money for the first time, able to afford perhaps even to buy a house. The idea of then stopping that and giving that up is probably quite scary for some people. So I can see why that factors into some people's decision.
No, absolutely. And it is something that will definitely, affect women more. So that's it could be a very tough choice for someone who's kind of just gained, a bigger level of independence and then possibly having to kind of give that up for a family.
Mm-hmm.
And now a quick message from money.ca.
Money.ca is proud to bring you this episode of Half Banked. You've got important money questions. That's why you're listening to this podcast. From buying a home to investing for your retirement, Money.ca is the place to get all the info you need to live a richer life. What is an ETF anyway, and how do I choose the right ones to invest in? Should I go with a variable or a fixed rate mortgage? How can I maximize my retirement savings while still contributing to my kids' RESP? The Money.ca team invests hours researching and interviewing leading experts to bring you the best guides and the latest news that matter to you and your finances. For every stage of your financial journey, Money.ca is here to help you get ahead.
And now we have Therese Shechter, a filmmaker, public speaker, and the founder of the production company, Trixie Films. Her latest project, My So-Called Selfish Life, is a documentary that explores the taboo about choosing not to become a mother. Thank you for joining us, Therese.
Thank you for inviting me.
So your film definitely delves into the issue of more young Canadians choosing to go child-free, either for longer or permanently. And can you take us through basically how there are some economic and financial factors that might play a role in the narrative of your film and perhaps in your personal decision?
I think that financial factors are one part of the equation when people think about whether they want to become parents or not. Certainly, it's very expensive to raise children in any economy. In my film, actually, one of the women in the film talks about how she and her partner waited 20 years to decide to have children because it was only then that they felt financially secure enough to have a baby and raise a child the way they wanted to. This is a product of a lot of fairly serious decision making. But there are a lot of other factors aside from financial. Some people are concerned about things like climate change. Some people can't find the right partner. And sometimes people just don't want children.
So, as I understand it, there's actually a bit of a difference in the terminology between childless and child-free. So, Therese, can you please explain that to us and the audience so that we understand?
Yeah, absolutely. The term child-free is somebody who does not want to have kids and does not have kids. It's a specific decision. Someone who is childless does want kids, but for a variety of reasons doesn't have them. This could be for medical issues. It could be because they haven't found a partner. It could be for many reasons. And it's important to make that distinction because they're two distinct groups with two distinct desires. However, child-free and childless people do come under the same kind of scrutiny and criticism for not following the prescribed path of parenthood. There is a technical term called temporarily childless, which refers to people who plan to have children at some point, but have not yet. I do hear the term child-free lifestyle a lot, and I don't really like it. And there is a correlation between economic and reproductive freedom and having fewer kids. Like older boomers, for example, grew up in a time where women didn't have much financial freedom at all. They couldn't get bank accounts and they couldn't get credit cards and their husbands had to sign for them. So when women have economic freedom, when they have reproductive freedom, they can make better decisions for themselves. It's actually a profound privilege, like to have the tools to control my reproduction, to have the freedom to control my reproduction. So it's much, much more than a lifestyle. Lifestyle seems pretty frivolous for something that's such a profound decision about whether to bring a human into the world or not, and everything that goes with that.
No, that is a very good point. Thank you. And I was also wondering, so, as part of the documentary, My So-Called Selfish Life, you've interviewed people who are in that position themselves, who know they want to be child-free. Because I was wondering, did any of them mention any specific financial goals or worries that they had that affected their decisions, such as trying to, pay off student debt first, buy a house, anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, student debt came up a lot, actually. And some people, not necessarily people in the film, but there were many people I spoke to. I should say that before I started making the film, I did a survey because I only knew my own story. And I really wanted to learn the stories of other people. And I put one post on Facebook back in 2016 with a survey saying, "Tell me about your life without children." And I got 1,900 responses in the first week. So that freaked me out a little bit. But I also thought, this is probably going to be a good film that people might be interested in. A lot of the things that people were saying were tied to finances in certain ways. One was, I have so much student debt, I don't know how I could ever raise a child because I have so much debt to clear myself. But another aspect was, I'm an artist, I live on a very small income, and I want to continue doing my art. And if I have a child, I will have to stop being an artist because I will have to make enough money to support my family. I myself would not be able to make enough money to properly raise a child. Now, a lot of people have children and they're not making a lot of money and they get by, but they want children and they're going to make it work and they figure it out, like my own parents did. So it really depends on the person. But I do think that there is an awareness of what it would take financially to give a child a decent life and not wanting to bring a child into the world that wouldn't, in their opinion, be cared for properly.
It's interesting. Of course, there are a lot of reasons and a lot of things that go into this decision. Therese, you said that you knew you didn't want to have a child since you were a teenager. At that time, were finances at all part of that decision, or Or was it a whole lot of other things?
You could ask me why I didn't become a doctor. You could ask me why I didn't move to Spain. It would be the same reason. I just didn't want to. I will say, though, that I always assumed I would have children because that's the world we live in. We're raised to assume that that's our job, to have children. So I went through my 20s and 30s assuming I would have children. And in terms of my finances, I did put a lot away for retirement. I wanted to be financially independent. There were a lot of things that I felt like I should do. And then one day I realized, oh, wait, I don't actually have to have children if I don't want to. But I'm still very glad at the financial planning that I did in the meantime, because it's good for everybody, whether you have children or not.
And I was wondering earlier, you did mention kind of looking at retirement planning. So I was wondering if, with your experience, have you been able to basically save up for other, big financial goals earlier?
I was always really conscious about putting money aside for retirement. I think that in my very first jobs, I maxed out the amount of money that I could put towards retirement pretty consistently. I just wanted to have some control over my life and my future. And you never know what will happen and what life will bring you. While I had, really well-paying jobs, I just made sure to put as much money towards retirement as possible. The other thing when people don't have children, this is often a threat that's kind of used against us, which is who will take care of you when you get old. It's a real common thing that people say. And I always feel like we really should not be planning to give birth to people just so they can take care of us when we're old, which is sort of the implication of that statement. So instead of birthing my elder care, I thought I should just have this money. So I think all of us really should be thinking of that and thinking about how we'd like to live our, let's say, senior years. And I do think setting aside money for retirement is really fundamental to that.
And I was wondering as well, if you're thinking about young couples or considering that child-free lifestyle, from your own experience, do you believe there are any specific financial considerations or questions that they sort of need to think about if that's what they want to pursue? Anything that's come up with your own experience?
One thing that I think is really important for people without children, and that's, by choice or by circumstance, is to make out a will, because you don't have obvious heirs. Think about where you want your assets to go. Is it to other family members? Is it to friends? Is it to charity? I think it's a really wonderful exercise to sort of think through that stuff and think about how you're best able to share your own wealth, however you define that, with others. That's something my husband and I did, and we really thought about it for a long time. Which family members, which friends, which charities, which other organizations we wanted to support. Because again, it's not clear cut. You don't really want to die without those kinds of affairs settled, because it leaves a big mess for the people who have to take care of it after you're gone. I just can't stress this enough to really think about this.
Your documentary is called My So-Called Selfish Life. Does that stem from people thinking your economic freedom is selfish? You not spending money on children and spending money on yourself instead is, to some people, deemed selfish. Is that kind of where this is coming from?
I think in part it's coming from that. I think that people imagine I'm on my golden yacht rolling around in $100 bills on a, diamond bed or something. I think there is a sort of performative aspect of some people who don't have kids who post a lot on Instagram about their wine tasting tours of southern France and how great their lives are because they don't have kids and they have lots of money. So the idea of calling somebody without kids selfish is a little bit suspect. But I also think that people with children are called selfish for a variety of things. I think having children just so someone will take care of you when you get old is supremely selfish, if I'm being honest. So the word selfish is used whenever somebody doesn't approve of what you're doing.
All right. Thank you. I think that's some very good points. Thank you for adding that. I appreciate that. And so we really want to appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule. Good luck with the film. So thank you so much for your time, Theresa.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
All right. So that was interesting. Kadeem, what did you take away from that?
I guess there was a lot, because I guess this issue, touches on a lot of kind of sociological aspects too, but If you're focusing on the finance side, I guess it was, for me, brought me back to episode 2, where we kind of talked about wills for young people, like how that's very important, especially if you don't have kids, because, there isn't going to be kind of any assumption that your kids will either get it or split it between themselves or whatever it is. There is just kind of like even more of a headache when it comes to figuring that out if you don't have that set before you go.
Mhm.
And I guess if you made that decision as a young person, then it's even more important to actually get on a will early, even if it's something you think you don't need because you're not older.
Another thing that she said that kind of stuck with me a bit was the example she gave about the artist. I
Right.
thought that was really interesting because, you might have a calling in life, whether it's artist, it doesn't even need to be artist. It might even be, a professional job that you really want to put all of your time and effort into. And you do have to make compromises when you have children. And perhaps, I don't know how stable her income was. I don't want to presume anything there. But it is a choice that you have to kind of make, and you have to weigh that up.
Yeah, because then maybe, her salary worked for her, but she's just thinking, if she has a kid, though, she has to
Yeah.
make more money, has to be more stable. It's not really just about you in that sense. And basically in that case, she had to kind of either give up a dream or maybe put it like on the back burner. It has to become a side thing she works on. It can no longer be her main thing.
I think part of that is that people, and every parent, I imagine, wants to do this, give their child the best possible life. But
Right.
what does that mean? There are so many different kind of ways to factor all of this in, and it is interesting.
Yeah, and I think especially if you're young and end up having kids, like it can just be tough. I think it's one of those things. It's there is the commitment piece and just the piece of having someone to help you out, but yeah, just the financial piece of like raising one child on one income. And again, especially if you had a job that is talking about the stability piece, if you have a job that is not kind of a permanent full-time one with full benefits, and even then that can still be tough once a kid gets past a certain age to be able to like manage working, full-time for yourself and then also caring for a child.
Tricky, lots to think about.
Absolutely.
All right, that's a wrap on season 1 of Half Baked.
Thank you to all the guests who shared their insights with us.
Yeah, it's been so much fun. I've just personally really enjoyed learning about all of these topics.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure that our listeners have had some great takeaways as well. So amazing guests. Thanks, everybody.
And what was your favorite episode?
I'd have to say I enjoyed the tiny home van living one. I know it's a popular episode, but it was a fun conversation. How about you?
I'll say actually I like 10.5 a lot. It's just riffing as well was fun with the random questions. But if I have to pick another one, perhaps I might go with lifestyle creep. I think that one stood out for me. Very interesting topic and very relevant.
But yeah, that one hit home.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe a little too close to home, but I think maybe that's why it still has a little place in my heart.
Yeah, it's great. Well, special thanks to our publisher, Wise Publishing, for giving us the chance to bring you this podcast.
We hope we've been able to help demystify and break down some of your biggest money questions.
Yeah, thanks everyone for listening. And if you haven't already done so, please follow us on social media at Half Banked, like our posts, share, and spread some personal finance love.
I'd like to thank our producers, Shane, James, Kevin, and our lead producer, Sam.
Also, big shout out to Mohammed and Marie for all of their technical support through this first season.
This episode was edited by Lead Podcasting. Until next time.